Okay. Had a rough week, but it was a good week overall. And I guess, we got some things accomplished and stuff. But I wanted to do a video with my discussion with TRock, which was pretty good. We had a little, not too in depth conversation. We had a little back and forth a little bit, and it was pretty good, really. It wasn't bad. So I wanted to go through that and see how it went. Okay, so here we go. Uh, make sure everything is good. What's this? Oh, okay. All right. Uh, so without delaying anymore, like I just did, let's go ahead and play this video. Okay, so we got views. Okay. All right. So let's just play a little bit of this and we'll just look into it. It wasn't a big discussion, it wasn't too involved, but it was a start. I have to admit, it was a start. It's just that it doesn't seem like people realize the significance of this point of discussion. It's very important, I believe, because it shows. I mean, it resolves a lot of issues that atheists have with creationists, young Earth creationists in particular. But there's a little bit of hesitancy because of the severity of the breakup of the continents that I've been through before. It actually cut the lifespan in half a second time of people living after the global flood. That's how severe it was, but people are a little bit hesitant to go with what the Bible actually says, unlike what TRock said in the discussion, is that it doesn't mean the earth was divided. It says the earth was divided. That's what it says. Now, and there's nothing to think otherwise either. In the context, outside the context, anywhere. But it is important discussion and it resolves a lot of issues that creationists have with presenting their views. Like also with old earth creationists as well, because the old earth creationists, they're completely out of it because they're not even, I mean, they're not even presenting the historical narrative, the only history that we have. So they're completely out of it as far as the timeline is concerned. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and look into some of this.
Gentlemen,
Right.
if you had any thoughts on that, maybe Carlos will want to join. But before we shut it down, to be fair, Jungle Jargon, you didn't
Yeah.
have enough time to ask TRock a question in our last open mic on the fossil record. And so maybe this was predestined to happen, where now you have the opportunity to
Yeah.
ask
There you go.
TRock that question. Did you want to do that before we wrap things up, Jungle Jargon?
Sure. If TRock is up for it.
Sure.
Yeah. I started before trying to ask a question, but my question was whether or not you've heard the evidence or seen the evidence for a breakup of the continents after the global flood, and it didn't seem like you understood or knew what I was trying to ask.
No, that's a fair point. I really didn't. I didn't quite get the gist of what you were asking, but you were, I guess, were asking, was I aware of specific physical evidence in the world
Yeah,
that the breakup happened after the flood?
yeah.
So, to be honest with you, no, I'm not really familiar with any particular evidence anybody's put forth that it happened after the flood. I've heard some of the arguments, but mostly it's centered around what the Bible says about the days of Peleg and so forth. But as far as actual physical evidence, no. But I would be glad if you could kind of share some of that.
Right, because you were addressing geology and you're an engineer, and so I was thinking you should know or understand some of this, but like you said, you never heard of any evidence. And to be honest, I haven't heard any evidence from creationists either, very much, other than what the Bible says that in the day. And this is a surprise to me that there's not any significant creationists who have even considered the breakup of the continent after the global flood, in spite of all the evidence, some of which I'll present in this video. But it's amazing to me that there's nobody even talking about it, seems to me. Days of the Peleg, the earth was divided, and people began to speak their own languages.
So,
But
did you have specific physical evidence that you wanted to talk about?
yeah, well, that was an interesting question. Is like, I'm going to show you the evidence for the breakup of the continents after the global flood. And TRock asked me, do you have any specific evidence? that's, that's what I'm here for. I mean, yeah, there's, like I said in the last time, there's a lot of evidence to support it. One of which would be the sediment layers themselves, which uh, line up, as well as the fossil evidence. The the fossils in the sediment layers line up between the continents as well. Are you aware of that?
Sure. Yeah, there's basically both the sedimentary and the fossil distribution that spans across continents that are no longer connected. Yes.
So then the question would be how, if the sediments were deposited in the global flood, and how how would you have a breakup if the breakup was before the sediments were deposited? How would the sediment layers be lining up between the continents along with the fossils?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an interesting question, and TRock clearly sees the problem here, is that you can't, either the sediments were deposited and broke up after, or the whole timeline of the breakup is all wrong. So a lot of people have, the breakup as being the cause of the global flood, the cause of the fountains of the deep opening up. Now, it seems that there's a possibility of the fountains of the deep be just basically water under the Earth's surface at the time of the global flood. By that I mean, it seems to me that the much of the Earth was simply liquefied at the time of the global flood. Much of the soil and earth uh, that was there from the previously being underwater, then it came up out of the water in creation, in the days of creation. But that earth basically became liquefied with all the turmoil and tumult and everything, and that's why you have the stratification. The separate, the different sediment layers and everything with the different fossils and everything. depending on where it was, but with, of course, the sea life at the very bottom, and then the sea life is mixed in with all the other animals as well, all the way through the fossils that were buried, the animals that were buried. But you have to have these sediment layers laid down first, and then you have to have a breakup. Now, notice what TRock is going to explain here or say.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It really is, and that's one of the difficulties in working out the specific mechanisms and some of what I was trying to put forth in my proposed model. There are some nuances like that are really difficult to nail down, and so I've personally kind of gone back and forth on the whole continent splitting up before or before the end of the flood, at the very end, or post flood. I'll say very generically that the continents were probably still had a fair degree of quote unquote rapid motion after the 371 days that the Bible describes. Um, take that for what you
Well,
want, because you could put that time anywhere in there. Go ahead.
so then you think the breakup was a continuation of the global flood?
Yes, I absolutely, because it's continuing to this day. I mean, that's why you have so
Right.
many evolutionists that want to harp on this idea of plate tectonics and mountain ranges lifting up and so forth. And the way I describe it is
So
that is that
so then it would have to.
what you see today is residual motion of the original continental sprint.
Okay, so the five or six mega sequences were deposited in the global flood, and then they broke up.
Well, no, that's a great point, because that absolutely does appear to be per exactly what you identify. If you've got this sedimentary and fossil distribution, it's the sedimentary distribution to me that makes the real point. But they're kind of tied together. So
Yeah, and the fossils are very important in regard to the global flood because the global flood is the only thing that can make fossils, and the fossils are the evidence of the global flood, which is very significant. But then they broke up. They clearly broke up, and I say break because they had to have broken up after the global flood. And TRock is trying to make it like at the very end, somehow the sediments were deposited, or the cause of the fountains of the deep happened first, but then it was delayed or something, and then they broke apart at the toward the end or of the flood. Somehow they broke up toward the end of the flood instead of toward the beginning of the flood. Uh, Underwater, I guess, but which is still a problem, as we'll see.
it's okay to say it either way, but
Well,
because they do span across no longer connected continents, that pretty much tells you that the sediments were laid down first and then the continents broke up.
yeah,
Now,
that's what it seems like it would be the case. And there's another line of evidence too. Are you familiar with the glacial striations in India that go from south to north?
no, I got to think about that for a minute. Glacial striations in India. So what you're saying is, for example, you have a very large glacier and it's got a lot of debris in its underside, and it's basically made drag marks across the continent at some.
Well, this glacier is a very large glacier indeed, but it's covering the entire face of the continent of India. I mean, at least in the south. And it's not just a single glacier. covering huge areas of land, entire, sections of the continents. It's not just a small little glacier, and it clearly, obviously, didn't come up out of the ocean and to cover and go north in India.
At some point.
Yes, but this is a point that evolutionists or people that believe in deep time would bring up the fact that there's glacial striations. And had a little bit of a discussion with AI, and I said that the striations are on top of the sediments in India going south to north, and AI corrected me and said, no, it's on top of the bedrock.
Well, okay, so no, that's an interesting point, but I don't know. Do you spend very much time on CMI's website?
I'm sorry, I'll be back. My phone died. So I want to go back and listen to what Donnie said, so he doesn't have to backtrack. I'll be back later.
So, Jungle,
I do. I mean, I listen to their videos. Yeah.
Okay, so do
I
you
listen
read
to
any
just
of their,
about everything. I listen to just about anything and everything from
you,
any creation mystery, as long as it's young Earth and not too
but do
boring.
you read any of their articles?
Well, I'm trying to get to the evidence of
Okay, well, no, that's fine. That's fine. I only want to point that out because they're a good source to help you with this idea of the glacial striations in India. So I'm not trying to comment one way or the other that I think that.
Now, this point he's going to bring up is just really, scratch, looking for something. It's not. It's another thing like looking for excuses again in face of the evidence. It's trying to explain another way. Because, like I said, the glaciers covered the entire face of the continents in the south, or sections of the continents in the south, and it's not a small thing. It's not an insignificant thing, and it's not a thing up for debate whether or not it was a glacier. I mean, there is debris from glaciers. It's kind of obvious that it was a glacier because the glaciers can move sediment and rocks miles and miles away from where their origin was. So it wasn't a small thing. It wasn't insignificant, and it's not really up to be questioned. And if anybody's questioning the glaciers, there's a problem with that because it's very well established science.
They aren't this because, like I've already said, I'm not really familiar with them. But CMI points out in some of their technical articles, or even if they're popular level layman articles, they point this out that argument from evolutionists about glaciation and the striation. I can't remember what they call that, but anyway, that's a common argument, but it's loaded with a major fallacy in.
And another thing is he's using it like it's an argument for evolution. No, it's not an argument for evolution. It's an argument or evidence supporting what the Bible actually says for face value. In the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Taking that at face value, that's what happened, and it explains everything. All the problems of surfing monkeys and everything is explained with a breakup of the continents 100 years after the global flood.
That you can actually get that exact same thing from basically uprooted trees that drag debris with them, like rocks and dirt and stuff like that. And so it's really hard to distinguish whether it's literally from a glacier or whether it's from.
And again, it's not hard to distinguish. It's very well established science, and it's extensive glacial striations and debris. Both are in South America, Africa, India, and Australia. All of these, and if you're talking about glaciers, that had to have happened after the global flood. That's what the problem is. So not only the sediments had to break apart after the global flood, but to solidify the point that they broke up after the global flood is the glaciers on top of the sediment layers that were from the global flood that mark the position of the continents where they were immediately after the global flood. And there's a lot more to it if you look into it, because Antarctica might not have been at the South Pole. It might have been a little over to the other side, while the actual pole could have been in South Africa, because that's what the glacial striations seem to indicate. So there's a lot of information, and it's very well documented, and it's massive. The evidence is massive.
From vegetation, root systems. When an entire tree root system gets pulled up, it can absolutely pick up rocks and stuff with it, and do the same thing that a glacier will do.
Yeah, well, regardless, it's pretty well known what's glacial markings and stuff and deposits, but it would have the problem in India. It would have to be some kind of movement that came up out of the ocean and went north in India. That's just not going to happen.
I mean, like I said, I don't think I could comment one way or the other what I think it is. I'm just really saying that beware of some of those evolutionary arguments, because they're not necessarily rooted.
Again, he's worried about the evolutionary argument. The evidence is not evolutionary. The evidence is of what happened. The evidence is of the global flood and the breakup after the global flood, which explains how the animals got everywhere they were going in the first place.
In a complete picture of how processes actually play out.
Yeah, so the complete picture is that it's not just India, it's South America,
right?
It's Africa, it's Australia,
right?
And India, which were all connected to the South Pole, Antarctica,
right?
And they all have glacial striations going from south to north from when. So this is like, these glacial markings are like a seal. It's like a stamp, a seal. Like when you write a letter and you put a seal on there. It's a seal that shows and confirms that the continents were still joined up until 100 years after the global floods in the days of Peleg. And then the seal was broken. That's the glaciers. The glaciers acted like a seal on the document, showing that it hadn't been opened yet, showing that the continents hadn't broken apart yet. They hadn't spread out yet. I mean, this is hard evidence of the breakup of the global flood 100 years, the breakup of the continents 100 years after the global flood. And the sediment layers are strong evidence, but then you have this seal on top of it's a big seal on top of the continents that stamped and joined South America, Africa, India, and Australia to Antarctica. And that seal was there after the global flood, because the glaciers are from after the global flood. And then that seal was broken, just like when you open up a letter or something with a seal on it. That seal was broken in the days of Peleg. It's just hard evidence. They were still connected to Antarctica after the global flood, on top of the sediments and fossils that were deposited first, and then
Yeah, so that conversation kind of approaches the idea of where's the post-flood boundary, right?
no,
It
it
sort of
has
it
nothing to
does.
do. Oh, the post flood. Oh, the post flood boundary. Yeah.
Well, the point being that if it's,
Well,
it sounds like what you're kind of saying is that perhaps the continents broke up after the flood, and you had an ice age. You built up a bunch of glaciation, and now you have some geological evidence.
but it's not about the post flood boundary per se. I'm not talking about the post flood boundary, even though it is. I'm talking about the, like I said, the seal of this glacial, the glacial activity that shows that all the continents were still joined up until 100 years after the global flood. And, of course, it's the post flood boundary, but that's, then you have erosion or whatever, it just covers the bedrock. I mean, that's what we have today all over the world is that we have soil and sediment on top of the bedrock. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this seal of the glacial activity or markings that show that the continents had not broken apart yet until 100 years after the global flood.
It's left behind. In other words, if you see these glacial striations, it's a post-flood process, right?
But yeah, without getting too complicated, it's probably post flood.
Right.
Yeah, it's a post flood process. Yeah.
And that was my only point. If it's post flood, that means that that probably, and what you said, it's right on top of what looks like obvious flood sediments, right?
The bedrock. It's right on top of the bedrock, which is what AI said the glacial striations are.
I would be really careful with what you get out of AI, though. Really careful.
Right, but it was just funny to me because I was trying to convince it of a whole bunch of things, one of them being the breakup of the continents, and it corrected me.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it
But the
wasn't
correction was funny because I didn't mean that the striations are on top of soil or sediment that's not from the global flood, that or erosion. I meant the stuff that was there after the global flood,
right.
Not accumulations on top of it.
You just have to know that AI is actually trained to tell you more popular opinion than it is.
Oh yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah. That's
so,
and I actually convinced AI of a bunch of things, but that's a side note.
Yeah. So back to your original question about how you perceive when the continents broke up. So AIG and guys like Andrew Snelling and some of those guys argue very strongly against post-flood continental split.
Okay, now this is what I would like to know: why this aversion to a post-flood breakup of the continents? With all, especially considering all this evidence that nobody clearly has been talking about or considering. But why this aversion to something that would answer so many questions? It would explain so many questions that the skeptics and evolutionists have. I mean, they're always asking, they even ask about the glacial markings in India going from south to north. The glaciers didn't come up out of the ocean and cover India, especially where India is today. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, this is, you can't deny the evidence. You have to agree with the evidence. And the evidence is not that the glaciers jumped up out of the ocean and covered India. That's not the evidence. The evidence is that India was connected to Antarctica at the time of the glaciers covering India, or the southern part of India. That's evidence, and that was after the global flood. That's solid evidence. It's just you can't be denying what the actual evidence is. And there's no reason to be afraid of the evidence because it explains everything. It explains all the problems. Like, how did the kangaroos get to Australia? Explained. How did the monkeys get to America? Explained. How did the mammoths get buried? Explained. How did the tsunamis and entire ecosystems get buried up in the Arctic and Siberia? Explained. It explains everything. All these questions that people have are explained by the evidence that you cannot deny. So why is there such a aversion to the breakup of the continents after the global flood when it's exactly what the Bible says to begin with? The Bible actually says it, but of course it didn't explain a whole lot about it, because then people would be like, there's so many people who read that would be like saying, well, the Bible's not true. The Bible's not true. Even though it is true, obviously, it still says the earth was divided.
And they're like extremely adamant about it, but the majority of their reasoning has to do with 2 points. One, that the biblical text is really just referring to a division in language, not a physical.
The text does not refer at all to a division in language. The earth is not a language. In the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. There's no question about the text. And the text in no way refers to a language or people being divided. It says the earth was divided. Now, if you just take it for face value, there's no reason to think otherwise, because there's no context anywhere to show otherwise. It's just what people believe that it said, because the people were also divided, but it's because of the catastrophic event that happened, that occurred, that caused people to separate and isolate into family groups and begin speaking their own language, because they're not going to speak their own language when they're all together building the Tower of Babel. They're going to be speaking the same language. They're only going to speak different languages when they isolate and separate. Then they speak their own language. And this is a no, if you're from South America and bilingual, this is a no-brainer to you. But it's one of them things.
Division of the earth. That's the one prong of their argument. The other prong is that they think that it would literally kill everybody.
This, I need to address this a little bit. They think it would kill everybody. It didn't. It cut the lifespan in half a second time, yes, and it was catastrophic, yes, and it was severe, and even the meaning of the word Peleg changed after the days of Peleg. So the name Peleg in the original Hebrew, clearly means divided, because it says so. But in the later Aramaic form of Hebrew, which is what they spoke later, everybody, it no longer meant divided. Peleg meant as the waters flowed, or where the waters flow, clearly between the continents that were divided.
That was alive post flood, if that happened.
Mm,
I
right.
don't think that's a very good argument myself.
But the thing is like I wanted to mention before when you're talking about it, it's not so much how it happened, it's just evidence that it did happen.
Right.
And
Okay.
then the how that it happened could be explained if you investigate or look into. Oh yeah, so the how would be kind of obvious because if the Earth's crust was still new, relatively new and unstable, still unstable, which it obviously was because it was all at the South Pole on one side of the South Pole, wobbling, making the Earth wobble. And glacier and ice building up in Antarctica as well would increase the wobble and the instability. So what's underneath the plates is clearly would be magma would be underneath the plate. So it's not going to kill everybody because the magma, of course, would be underneath the oceans anyway. Now, yes, it would have there would have been heat released, but we just had a catastrophic event called the global flood that basically exposed the Earth to the cold of outer space. Whereas before it was a greenhouse before the flood, but after the flood, the pressure decreased, the oxygen decreased, and there the Earth's surface became exposed basically to outer space for all intents and purposes, freezing the polar regions. Obviously, because there was glaciers at the South Pole, which included South America, Africa, and India and Australia that were still connected to the South Pole. That's like a seal on a letter that wasn't broken yet. That clearly wasn't broken yet because it connects and ties all those continents as being one unit. Because the glaciers are not going to come up out of the ocean and jump on the land and move north. That's just absurd. Into it
Sure.
because
I will tell you now. Again, I'm not trying to have. I just don't have a firm opinion on whether the continental breakup happened post flood or not, except to say that there is one very plausible reason why it started before the flood ended, and yet you still have the sedimentary distribution that you talked about, and that is that in the process of the flood, because it is a full 1 year plus time span, you've got deposition only happens for a percentage of that time anyway. And then after deposition, you're pretty much at the end of the what they call the inundation phase. And now you're in the recessive stage where the waters are receding back off the continents. So the point then is that you can lay all of the sediments in the first, we'll say, 5 months. That's the 150-day time frame given in the Bible. If you lay all the sediments in the first 5 months and then split the continents after that, you still get the same look.
no, that's not true because you still have the seal of the glaciers that was clearly post flood joining and connecting South America, Africa, India, Australia to Antarctica. So that seal was still there post flood because the glaciers are not going to be there pre flood because of the flood. Because the glaciers are on top of the sediments that were deposited by the flood, including the fossils in them. And, of course, the fossils are in Antarctica as well. And they all join all those continents together, the fossils do, and the sediment layers. Yeah, but they seem to want to use the split up as being the mechanism for the global flood, for the deep fountains of the deep breaking up. But another
Well,
problem is
you got to separate those two, though. You got to separate those two. The mechanism. Well, and to be perfectly clear, whenever I was giving my presentation, I was basically disagreeing with aspects of every one of the popular models, but agreeing with some aspects of every single one of them, essentially. And so, if you're talking about the CPT model, for example, they believe that the accelerated nuclear decay started plate subduction, which.
Okay, so since all these models are contrast each other, seem to be contradicting each other, it's like, why don't you go with a model that actually works? A model that explains everything, which is not a model, it's what the evidence shows to begin with. It's there, and it cannot be removed ever. And you cannot deny what the evidence shows.
Which I strongly disagree with. It's not even physically, it's not even a viable model at all. How people with PhDs in anything would sign off on that is honestly beyond me. I just don't get it. But so what they're talking about started the deal. You are correct in that sense. They want to say that accelerated radiometric decay started the splitting process and caused the flood to ensue afterwards. So that in that model, you're correct. But if you look at the hydroplate theory, Walt Brown's, again, I disagree with a lot of what he says in his book, but I do agree with some aspects of it. His is a little different, and this is a point I honestly just do not know about his model. And that is, so he says very much what I was saying. The hydroplate part of it, I'm agreeing with. What he says triggers it is very different, though. He says lunar tidal pumping basically pressurizes these water chambers under the continents and in the ocean floor, and over time, so much pressure is built up that they finally rip apart, and that's what starts the flood. Now, if you take that at face value, you would come to the same conclusion. Per your point, he's saying that ripping the continents apart was the beginning of the flood. I'm not saying any of that. And I'm agreeing with the part that the continents set on large water chambers. They ruptured and the continents started moving. But my mechanism is different, and the timing it can be very different depending on.
Okay, it might not have necessarily been water chambers, even though it could have been, but it seems clear to me that these sediments, pre-flood sediments, became liquefied because the water used to come up from the ground at night and water the foliage. There wasn't rain to speak of. So every night, possibly with a lunar pole, the water would come up out of the ground and water everything. And then in the daytime, it would probably dry out a little bit or something. But when it began to rain, then that combined with the water already under the earth that was coming up every night, and it just basically liquefied all of the sediments, the pre-flood sediments, however that was. And of course, it broke apart all the root systems holding together and everything. And of course, we see the result today is what they call the fossil record, which is pre-flood living organisms preserved for us to see with our own eyes today what was there before the global flood, which is all the sea life and the animal life and extreme life, which was extremely biodiverse pre-flood. Of course, we're losing all that. We've lost all that, and we're not getting it back. And we're going to continue to lose our biodiversity until it's just no longer viable anymore. That's what you call, there's genetic entropy and there's geologic entropy too. So the earth is not getting any better, and we're losing species. We're not gaining any species. We're just losing them. Same thing with stars. We're not gaining stars. We're losing stars. It's all going downhill. That's what entropy is. It's all going downhill. Once the Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall and cracks, there's no going back. You can't return to the state of order that you had before. This is basic, like TRock said, this is basic 101 science.
Exactly how I try and synthesize it all. But what I'm saying is the starting mechanism was either meteorite impacts, which Michael Ord identified, or we just don't know. Because the Bible says very specifically in I believe Genesis chapter 6, he says the Lord says, even I do bring a flood. In other words, it was no random happenstance. The Lord did it. He does not tell us what he used. It could have been, if it wasn't the meteorites, then we just don't know. But I'm assuming in my model it was the meteorites. So the point then, sorry, I'll try and wrap this up real quick. The point then was that if the meteorites impact out in the ocean floor, breaking open water chambers, it starts the process of the fountains of the deep breaking up, but it doesn't necessarily imply that the continents start splitting right away. What I actually suggest in my personal model is that once the fountains break up and you start depressurizing all that water that's under the continents, it takes some time to get that water out, get enough pressure release before the continents actually gravitationally start collapsing and then breaking. So
so a lot of these models are just too complicated. You're making it more complicated than it has to be. If we just go to the simple basic fact that water, the fountains of the deep, water would come up out of the ground at night and water the plants. And then if it starts raining, it's going to inundate everything, and the sediment layer is going to liquefy. It's going to join the rain with the water that's already there underground. I mean, sure, there could have been some underground chambers or whatever, water, but the ground was basically saturated with water to begin with, pre-flood. Then when you combine the rain with the water that's already there, the fountains, the springs, the water that would come up every night, the sediments, pre-flood sediments, would just simply liquefy. And then you have all the redeposition of all the sediment layers, well, with the exception of what was subducted. Obviously, a lot of the evidence was subducted and melted. But we still have, on every continent, we have sediment layers all the way down showing us examples of what existed pre-flood. It was just stacked in layers.
there is, in my model, there is a lag in time. It's not up front at the beginning of the flood.
Okay. In regard, but without explaining, with not considering that seal of the glaciers that stamped and connected South America, Africa, India, Australia, with Antarctica. Like those glacial markings is like a seal that stamps and shows that they were joined post-flood until the breakup in the days of Peleg. To the mechanism, I do see the possibility of a mechanism when, if you look at the evidence of what happened. For example, the evidence, according to the breakup after, was that all the continents were located at the South Pole, or all the landmass was located at the South Pole, of course, on to one side, and it had to have been because of the glaciers that formed, because the glaciers would have taken 100 years to form after the global flood. They wouldn't have happened right. Notice a clicking of the mouse. I have a mouse, but I don't use it. I'm not the one clicking the mouse. Just an observation, that's all. Away. I mean, it
Right.
wouldn't have happened during the flood for sure.
Right. No, that's a good
So
point. And so are you suggesting then that the glaciers existed before the flood began?
he's so involved with the clicking of the mouse, he's not even listening to what I'm saying. No. I'm saying they couldn't have existed before the flood.
Okay.
So they had to have existed after the flood, which means that all the continents were connected at the South Pole to one side of the Earth,
Right.
like they are still today, except they're more sprayed out. Which, because you're the engineer, right? So you should know about centrifugal force, right?
Sure. And that's a good point
And
because
you know about cement, right? You know about the guarantee for cement, what it's guaranteed for?
I'm not, no, I mean, I'm not a civil engineer, but go ahead
Oh,
and tell.
well, it's basically the same thing. Cement has, people joke, they say it has two guarantees. It's guaranteed against theft and it's guaranteed to crack.
Right.
So what happened as the sediment layers were becoming cement, basically, they began to crack. But that alone might not have been enough. There could have been another cause, like you say, an asteroid or something, which could have been the cause of the global flood to begin with. And like you said, that God caused it to happen. Yes, he did, because God causes everything to happen, whether it was an asteroid, whether it was natural, whether it was physical, whatever. Every aspect of everything is caused at the hand of God. Everything's by God, anyways. So when God says he gave people or confused the languages, yes, he confused the languages by way of whatever means. He still confused the languages because everything's by his hand anyway.
Right.
So when you have all this landmass at the South Pole, but not over the South Pole, to one side of the South Pole, and it's the cement, becoming concrete, basically forming rock and cracking. And it could have been another asteroid or something with some of the more evidence, because I'm not even getting into all the evidence yet. But just as far as the cause of the breakup of the continents, could you possibly see that the plates right after the globe, or 100 years after the globe, would have been somewhat still unstable, and suppose that an asteroid came and helped the continents to crack, the sediment layers to crack, and what would have happened in a spinning Earth is the centrifugal force would have caused all of the ones connected to the South Pole, if they broke apart, once they broke apart, which direction they would move would have to be north. Okay, as I'm explaining this, I think the wheels are turning inside of TRock's head. If you listen to the explanation, it's like, yeah, it basically makes sense. Right? From the South Pole because of the centrifugal force.
Centrifugal force isn't a real force.
So South America went north from where it was. Africa went north from where it was. See, because even though I explained it, maybe it's still clicking or something, but even though I explained it that as they each moved north, they separated from each other, he's still trying to say, no, but they separated from each other. Yes, but you can separate from each other going north. If each one of those continents moves straight north, due north, they are going to separate. But it took a while for him to get it, I guess. But well, he probably was thinking about something else. Australia went north from where it was. India went north from where it was. And as they went north, of course, they spread apart from each other.
So, yeah, I mean, you talk about centrifugal force. In reality, just to be perfectly honest, you can't really. It's very.
Donnie's getting anxious here. He's got something else on his mind.
Virtually impossible to make a definitive statement of centrifugal force versus. And I'll tell you what my basic explanation is. And so it's not centrifugal force per se, but if I'm following the standard.
See, this is why I talk about the wheels turning. It's not centrifugal force per se, but maybe it was.
The standard mainstream view on the rotation of the Earth and everything else, and I'm happy to do that. Generally, to your point, what you conclude, this is engineering 101. Literally at the 101 level, you do this, and I've heard creationists argue against the idea of the change in the tilt of the Earth. Some creationists will argue that the tilt was always what it is. Some will argue that there was no significant wobble as a result of the flood. If you follow standard mainstream viewpoint on Earth's spin, you have to conclude that the Earth wobbled and the tilt probably changed.
Yeah, I can agree with the wobble of the Earth that it's very likely or possible that the Earth wasn't wobbling before the flood, but then, especially if it was hit by an asteroid to cause the flood, and then again in the breakup of the continents, I could see it causing the Earth to wobble. That's not a problem with me.
And to your point, centrifugal force did play a part in how the continent split.
It can't because centrifugal force is not a real force.
That's irrelevant. You understand? But you understand?
No, it's completely irrelevant. You can't say something that it doesn't exist.
No,
you're plays
being
a part.
It
makes no sense. He might mean centripetal, but
Carlos,
not centrifugal.
You're being argumentative.
Centrifugal, it's supposed to be all the same thing. Anyway.
Centrifugal. If you're saying centrifugal, then centrifugal force is not a real force.
You're being argumentative. For you understand that the basic concept is just like when you put water in a bucket and spin it around in circles. The water wants to go to the outside. Period. It doesn't matter.
That's just a matter of inertia, but that's not centrifugal force.
It doesn't. Irrelevant. You get the point of the mechanism he's describing.
It's completely irrelevant. How is something that doesn't exist being
This is the problem with the educational system. It's talk about all kind of crazy stuff, and now you're arguing against the definition of centrifugal force. It's like a centrifuge, a centrifuge. That's where the word comes from. It's centrifugal force. centrifugal force, and it's a real thing because objects want to keep going the direction they're going, but if you have something to keep it from going straight, there's going to be like gravity, pushing out, pushing away. So it's a basic form of gravity as well, or inertia, like he says. But it's just semantics here. You talk semantics, and you're not even getting into the reality of what we're talking about. Not even able to follow the conversation.
Irrelevant.
You're
Carlos,
disrupting the
you're
conversation.
saying if the Earth is spinning and the continents break apart, nothing is supposed to make the continents follow the rotation momentum.
No, I'm not. Well, I'm not
That's
saying.
all he's describing. If he's using words that don't mean technically what you think they should.
No, it's a big difference. It's a big difference here because centrifugal force would be. He's trying to describe the direction in which these bodies will move based off of the spin. But you're saying centrifugal force is not a real force, so it's not really going to play a part.
That's not relevant.
Carlos, you're a little bit muffled. I'm wondering if there's I can turn up your volume on my end, but could it be your speaker on your phone? Maybe you get it.
But as far as the speed of the Earth, let me check my
Jungle. I will say this though: the one problem with a quote unquote centrifugal force cause in the separation of the.
So this is what I was talking about earlier. It's like he wasn't listening to what I was saying about going due north. It's like, I mean, the Earth is a globe. It's not a flat map. I don't know if he's thinking of a flat map or what, but it's not making any sense.
Continents is that they split away from a common. It's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. They split away from a common seam point between them, and so if the Earth is spinning from east to west, then they should both move the same direction if it's strictly this centrifugal force idea.
Well, they did go the same direction. They all went north, but
no, that's the problem. Is they didn't go strictly north.
Like, this is pretty rough. They didn't go straight north. Yes, they did go straight north. In the process, they separated from each other, obviously.
The U.S. If you go back when I put this up during that presentation, the Western Hemisphere went northeast.
I know what you're saying. They split apart from each other, and you can see it in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
Right, but
the
Eastern Hemisphere went northeast.
Was connected to the east coast of the United States,
right,
and Southern Africa was connected to South America.
Right. So the point though is that the Eastern Hemisphere went north to northeast, and the Western Hemisphere went north to northwest. And if it was,
I still having a problem with this because wait a minute. Yeah, I mean they are spreading apart from each other as they're going north, obviously. And then anyway, of course, in the process of going north, that's what happened to the mammoths when they got frozen, and all the animals in Siberia and North American forests and ecosystem either got frozen and or buried by tsunamis, and now we know the rest of the story. If you only listen to what the Bible said in the first place.
Was purely the result of centrifugal force, then they should both go the same direction.
No, they would go north. They all went north. The centrifugal force would cause them to go north, and that's what they all did. They all went north. As they did, they separated from each other, including India and Australia. When Australia broke apart from Asia, Asia just kept on going, and I could get into more of the other evidence evidence, and that's Donnie's gonna get nervous here in a little bit. Tsunamis and burials of all kinds of animals in the Arctic and Siberia, and entire
Hey, gentlemen.
ecosystems were
Gentlemen,
buried.
I think this has been a great back and forth. I think I'm going to start winding it down and try and wrap it up right at the 6.5 hours.
Well, that's the end of that. There, having a good discussion, getting into it, starting to scratch the surface of the hard evidence of the breakup of the continents after the global flood. And again, I was a little bit thwarted as far as being able to present the entire scope of range of evidence that there is to which explains everything. I've been through it many times before. Explains everything. And it will shut the mouth or the mouths of the lions. The evidence, the truth, shuts the mouths of the lions. So this aversion to the evidence and the truth is totally unfounded, especially considering the fact that it shuts the mouths of lions, the skeptics and atheists and everything. Hello, Manitiatu. How are you doing? God bless you. And that was the other one. Where am I? Hold on. Is he really? It's Patrick. There's Patrick Caricas. Long time no see, Patrick. Hello. Brian Noel. There we go. Says there was no global flood. Well, it's the evidence. The evidence is that there was a global flood. It's hard to deny what the evidence is, especially when it's all there. You'd have to prove otherwise with all the evidence of the global flood. And it's too bad that people are not educated at all in the educational systems. But anyways, that was about it. I don't know. I spent an hour going through the whole video, which a little bit exhaustive, but whatever. But I had to go through the video because it was, it was a pretty good conversation that I had with TRock. And it's good to review all this evidence, what the evidence is. And again, we have Patrick Caricas saying hello. And I mean, there's nothing to be afraid of. The truth is nothing to be afraid of. It's the truth that will set us free. It's the Word of God that is our Savior. The Word of truth is our Savior. So hold to the truth with everything you have, because it's the truth that will set us free. God bless everybody. Take care.